Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon. As an Air Force colonel, I spent nearly 30 years on active duty where my primary job was flying KC-135 and KC-10 air refueling tankers. As an Air Force officer, however, I had to reinvent myself often during my career and even afterwards when I transitioned from the Air Force to becoming a software development program manager in civilian industry. The ability to reinvent ourselves is a critical skill in today's dynamic environment. Before I get into that, though, I'd like to tell you a story about the night that I almost died in pilot training and what I learned from that experience. So we're starting right in here, folks. Strap in, we're going for a ride. It was a moonless October night in 1978 in West Texas. As I prepared to fly that evening, I strapped myself into the plane and I plugged my G-suit into the aircraft pneumatic system in my T-38 Talon supersonic jet. The G-suit was there to help us pilots maintain consciousness during aggressive high-G maneuvering. It was actually worn over our flight suits, and it would go around our waist and down our legs, and it would inflate during high-G maneuvers so that it would help prevent blood from going from your head down into your lower extremities. The Air Force wanted its pilots to be aggressive, and I was a good student. In fact, earlier that week, I had actually failed a flight for being too aggressive. In my haste to rejoin the formation lead, I actually accelerated during flight formation training. I actually accelerated so fast that I broke the sound barrier. Going faster than the speed of sound was prohibited by regulation, so my instructor had to mark me down for lack of airspeed control. And as he's telling me about why he had to mark me down, he explained it to me, but his tone of voice and his body language were all saying, "Attaboy." I was a 23-year-old second lieutenant in the Air Force, and I was doing well. At that time. In fact, I was doing so well that I was the first student pilot in my class to be chosen to solo at night in the T-38. And this was a great honor, and I appreciated it very much, and I was ready to go. I felt confident. As I started my engines at night, the two powerful jet engines on the T-38, I heard over the radio that because the winds had changed, they were changing the runway. This meant that I was going to be flying off of a runway that I hadn't flown on before during any of my training. Now, I didn't see this as a big problem because I knew what I was doing. I was confident. I had all the guidelines down. So I continued. I got permission from the control tower, and I taxied to the active runway and ran up my throttles to 100%. Once I saw that the engines were operating properly, I put the throttles into full afterburner. Now, afterburner is a mode in the T-38 and other fighter-type aircraft where raw fuel is being pumped into the back of the engine. It's kind of like a controlled explosion. And because the T-38 got most of its lift through just achieving speed, that afterburner mode was necessary in order to get up to 165 miles an hour so that I could take off in the confines of the runway. As I shot into the night that night, solo in my T-38, I felt wonderful. I felt like I was on top of the world. Things were going great. I flew a navigation leg around the city of Lubbock, Texas, and that was uneventful. And as I approached the airfield back again, Reese Air Force Base, I asked for an overhead approach to a touch-and-go landing. I was going to do some practice landings and then before I called it a night. And a touch-and-go, for those who may not be familiar with flying terms, a touch-and-go is where pilot lands the aircraft, and rather than pulling the throttles back and stopping, you push them forward and you do another takeoff. So you get a landing and a takeoff in the same maneuver. It's an efficient way to train. So I was going to do that. And I got permission to do that overhead pattern. So I flew up initial approach at 300 miles an hour. And it was 1,500 feet above the ground. And I got to the end of the runway, and I pulled the throttles to idle, and I made a hard 180 degree right turn to go on downwind leg. And downwind is where we reduce our speed and configure the aircraft for landing. And we also get displacement from the runway. At this point, I was flying parallel to the runway I was going to be landing on. I was flying parallel in the opposite direction. And it's important to get that displacement because you need a certain amount of distance so that when you make your final turn to final approach, you can do it and roll out on final and at the right altitude and lined up with the runway so you can land. Easy, I thought. And I was prepared to go, and it all looked good to me, except things were different. No one knew that the winds on the runway at ground level were completely different than the winds at pattern level where I was flying. So that was the first flight of the night. No one had checked that out prior to my arriving. On the ground, the winds were straight down the runway as you'd expect. At altitude, there was a 50-mile-an-hour crosswind that was pushing me and my aircraft closer and closer, reducing that displacement that I needed to make my turn. And since I was flying on a different runway than what I had trained on my previous night training, I didn't have my ground references. The lighted electrical shack and the intersection that I used to fly over to make sure I had the right displacement, they weren't there anymore. I had general guidelines, but those guidelines were for a no wind, no crosswind situation. So as I flew along downwind, I got closer and closer to the runway. It reduced my displacement. I did my 30-second timing past the end of the runway, and I made my turn. I started my hard right turn, reduced the throttles to idle, lowered landing gear, and I began to look over my right shoulder to pick up the runway. I was looking for my aim point. And an aim point is a spot on the runway that pilots use to aim at in order to make a safe landing. And the aim point isn't marked on the runway. It depends on the type of plane you're flying, what the runway conditions are, the weather, all that type of stuff. And so about seconds ticked by, and about halfway through the turn, I picked up my aim point and I saw that things were terribly wrong. I was far, far too low. Worse than that, I saw that I was banked up much too much. In my desire to make things look right in making that turn, I had banked far too, I was well over the amount I should be turning at. I was at 60 degrees more. I looked inside and looked at my angle of attack indicator, and it was bright red. And that meant that my wings were stalling. They were no longer giving me the lift to fly. I realized I was in an extremely dangerous situation, and I threw the throttles into full afterburner and raised the landing gear to reduce drag. I cross-checked my other instruments, and my vertical velocity indicator said that I was going down at 4,000 feet per minute. It was pegged at 4,000 feet per minute. My altitude showed me that I was falling through 1,000 feet. I was no longer flying, I was dropping out of the sky. I knew my heart was in my throat, and I knew that I needed to remain calm if I was going to have any chance of surviving. So I worked slowly to level the wings, and I continued my descent at full power so that I could regain the airspeed that I needed in order to be able to climb. I sank lower and lower into the unlit area in front of the airfield, and I actually saw the lights on the runway get flatter and flatter and flatter, and at one point the lights on the far end of the runway were actually blocked from view because there was a small rise in the runway. I was going below runway altitude. The airbase was built on a slight plateau. Finally, I reached the absolute minimum speed I needed to have to be able to start a climb. If I had tried earlier, I would have gone deeper into the stall. I started climbing slowly. At this point, I was at a 45-degree angle to the airfield, and I was aiming directly at the parked aircraft on the ramp. I crossed the edge of the airfield at about 10 feet above the ground. I flew over the aircraft, I flew over the hangars, I flew over base housing, all in full afterburner. I didn't get out of full afterburner or try even to turn my plane until I got to 1,500 feet. That's when the control tower asked me, "Reese 3-1 Solo, what are your intentions?" The whole thing took less than a minute. The last thing on my mind was what I was going to do next. I was just glad to be alive. I knew as I sped along at 180 miles an hour that I had a very important decision to make. I'll tell you how this ends in a few minutes, and spoiler alert, I survived. Life, as we know, though, is much more than just surviving. We are meant to thrive. You and I are meant to enjoy life. Just like that night in Texas, things can change for us in a heartbeat. And when things change, we need to reinvent ourselves. That might mean we need to change our plans. Our plans, my plans that night, needed to be changed. I couldn't continue flying the approach that I had originally intended, clearly. In the immediate moment, I needed to create a new plan, trust in my abilities, and use my training and my skill in order to get out of it, which I did. We all need to change in life. We all need to reinvent ourselves. We don't even need to change jobs to reinvent ourselves either. During my 30 years in the Air Force, I had to reinvent myself on numerous occasions. For example, the last job I had nothing to do with flying. I was a diplomat at the American Embassy in Belgium. And my wife, they sent my wife and me to language school to learn French at the age of 50. There are different ways where we can approach reinvention. We can approach it from a perspective of fear and indecision, where we're looking at ourselves as victims. When we do that, we give away our power. We let others and the situation that we're in decide how we're going to react and what we're going to do. There are times, just like when I was flying, where we all need to make an immediate decision. And if you find yourself in that type of situation, then what you need to do is make the decision, trust in your judgment, trust in your abilities, and don't look back. More often than not, though, we have the opportunity to do research, to look into what we want to do, and make a reasoned decision about where we want to go. There are occasions where we are faced with maybe two bad alternatives or two unfortunate alternatives, and if you find yourself in that situation, then oftentimes it actually does make sense to wait and see if something else better develops. But other than those situations that I just described, what we can do is approach reinvention and approach change from a holistic perspective. It's the best thing we can do. And how we do that is we look at what our values are, what are the principles that we live by, what inspires us. Do we need to rekindle our inspiration? All of these things should be taken into consideration, or you can take into consideration as you decide where you want to reinvent yourself. In today's world, for example, the jobs that were around when I was going to college are no longer around. And if they are around, they're done in a completely different manner. That requires us to update our skills, and it may even require us to reinvent ourselves. So I'm going to wrap up my story tonight, and I'd like to talk just briefly about the importance of courage. We need to live our life with courage. That night in Texas, I had a decision to make. And in fact, the air traffic controller offered me, when he asked me my intentions, he offered me an out. He said, how about if I put you on a long, straight, final approach to a full stop landing? I'm sure he knew that I was shook up, because I was, obviously. I had doubts at that moment about whether I even wanted to remain an Air Force pilot. I knew, though, that if I didn't continue the approach, or if I didn't try it again, I should say, that it would haunt me for the rest of my life. I would have surrendered to my fears. So I swallowed hard, and I asked for another overhead approach to a touch-and-go landing. I got permission. I turned onto downwind again, and the pattern I flew was wider and longer than what would normally be expected. I wasn't taking any chances. And I did a touch and go. After I took off, I asked for another one. And on that one, I flew it closer, and it was a lot tighter, more like I had trained. And then I asked for a full stop landing after that, because my fuel was at minimum level because I had used so much during afterburner go around. And I landed the aircraft, and the last approach and landing were perfect. And as I taxied back to the ramp, I was more than a little proud of how I had handled the situation and how I had conquered my fears. So I'm going to ask you, where have you almost crashed and burned and come out on the other side stronger and more courageous than ever? It's called reinvention, and you've all done it. If you're seeing, if you're feeling, if you're inspired to reinvent yourself now, if you're facing reinvention, you can do it. Ask yourself, what is your aim point? What are your desires? What do you stand for? What are your values and principles? You don't need to reinvent yourself alone. There are those of us who can help you, and you can be as successful as you absolutely want to be. Thank you for your time and attention. Thank you.